Dr. Eric Dietz and Jim Lerums. And Dr. Dietz was, at one point in time, led the effort to build the State of Indiana Department of Homeland Security. So that is one of his specialty areas. And Jim Lerums is a PhD candidate in the interdisciplinary program. So both very well versed. You'll be glad to know also that while Jim is a colonel in the U.S. Army, Dr. Dietz is a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. So we have a lot of different aspects represented here. So I'll turn it over to the guys.
Okay, great. Thanks. We're going to talk, well, last night most of us watched the basketball game, right? And, you know, basketball game wouldn't have quite been the same if we didn't have a score, right? We could have said Michigan played well, Michigan played up to their potential, but we could also say Michigan lost by 20 points, right? So this project basically started as that effort to try to start thinking about how do we look at cybersecurity in a way of measuring that. The last speakers talked about beginnings of this for the measurement process. A little bit of this is return on investment, but what I've challenged Jim to do with the introduction we had at least, how about we do this? My background was mentioned. For those of you guys who know me, I'm Eric Dietz. Some of friends in here, and then there's some others like Spaff and Doug Rapp, wherever Doug is. So I've got some background with this. Yep. So basically, why are we going backwards? Did I hit it? So the idea here was how do we measure? This was a challenge I had when we were at the state. We had lots of money to spend, lots of grant money to try to deal with security, urgently needed security efforts. And the challenge is trying to figure out where do we put the money in the best place. And so that's where Jim, as part of his PhD work, has been trying to look at this. And that's going to be really the context of the talk today. Part of this is going to be, you know, something that's still being staffed, and it's part of the governor's task force for cybersecurity that we'll go through in more detail. Jim?
A little bit about myself. Bear with me here. A little bit about myself. The last 7 years I spent on active duty was doing what's called knowledge management operations and staffing, both in the combat zone for 22 consecutive months, as well as in Europe. And so this effort that we're doing here is very similar to what I did at that time, which is how do you accelerate speed and confidence in making decisions and taking actions? A little bit of background about how we got to where we are today. Back when the vice president was governor in April of 2016, he signed and established the Executive Council for Cybersecurity in the state of Indiana. One of the first states to do something like this, to help encourage the public and private sector to work together, because as we all know, it's a team sport. It's an interdisciplinary team sport, no way around it. Governor Eric Holcomb has continued the program, and there's been different iterations of the charter that organizes all the different parties in this Executive Council. The Executive Council is primarily made of about 20 senior executives in both state, federal, local, academia, and private industry. This council has a strategic vision, the visions that you see before you. And if you look at these vision items, these are not really scorecard kind of things that you can do. They're important, they need to be done, but this alone did not provide us what we needed to get the scorecard going. Now, in January, the Executive Council, which you see toward the top of this structure, convened all these different committees and working groups. There's committees for different sectors, like for finance, defense industries, elections, healthcare, water, wastewater, energy, communications. And then there's different working groups that will work across all those different sectors. And one of the things that came out with, along many, many initiatives, and Doug Rapp will be talking about these initiatives tomorrow with the Director of Cybersecurity for the state, Shatrice Mosley, was a cyber scorecard specifically to measure how well the state and the private and public organizations are doing in the sectors you see before you, specifically to committees. Now, in addition to those scorecard requirements, Governor Holcomb, along with 38 other governors, signed what's called a Compact to Improve State Cybersecurity. It acknowledges that states are a target-rich environment for either financial gain or espionage, and they need to do something about it. It's not a passive option anymore. And concurrently, there's been, at the request of Congress, the Department of Homeland Security, being executed by NIST-CSF, a national cybersecurity review. Both of these different structures use what's called the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which I suspect most of you are very familiar with. Now, why is it attractive? Well, as I mentioned, the National Government Association is using it for their yardstick, and it's a living document. It changes. In fact, there's been changes submitted last year, and they're being processed in sometime this first quarter, possibly around April. We're going to see the updated version to the NIST framework. So it's a living document, and since the bad things that happen on the internet and the cyber world are changing, the document really can't afford to stay very static. What it does is it provides best practices that can be used not only by the public sector, but also by private sectors. And even has further details into the different sectors, like the ones that the state wants to measure. It breaks them down into 5 core functions: identification, protection, detection, response, and recovery. And these different items were brought together when the National Institute of Standards and Technology collaborated with a lot of cybersecurity experts to avoid reinventing the wheel and provide everyone the best standards to work from. It provides a common language for all these different organizations to work with. It's used, as I mentioned earlier, by the National Cybersecurity Review that happens once a year. It's handled by the NIST-CSF, and every other year that report is provided to Congress to see how the nation is doing in terms of cybersecurity. This last year, 48 different states participated. I think the previous year was 49. And what they've added for 2017, which we'll see in the report that comes out in April, is they've actually added further details for local government functions. So the education side, emergency services, so on. This is only for states, local, tribes, and territories. This is not for industry. But it uses the NIST format. It asks the 98 questions. Thought I'd said something wrong. It uses the NIST format, and what it does is it kind of gives you a measure, not only in terms of how these different areas are doing over the years, okay, but also how they're doing across the different functions based on the state, local, or territory. So it kind of helps you kind of home in on where the problems are. So for example, one of the comments I think in this 2016 report is that the states are leading in terms of embracing the NIST standards and doing all the right things. They're writing policies, they're starting to get money, and as that money flows and the policies are written, then the local governments will have a better chance of improving as well. The other thing that the NSCR National Cybersecurity Review does is it has these maturity levels, which it's a little more normal English than others would be accustomed to in our cybersecurity world. It gives you 7 layers. Starts with, we're not doing anything, to we're kind of doing it, but it's informal, to, oh, not only do we do it, we document it, we test it, we verify it, and by the way, we're smart enough to change things when the world changes with us. The NIST cybersecurity framework is not bad for scoring. It's a score of 0 to 5. Starts from like tier 0, non-existent, to tier 4, which is advanced. So that makes it easier for most folks that would understand the terminology used by the scoring for the NSCR to score themselves. Now, everything looks good so far. There's actually, if we're going to measure the different sectors that the IECC wants us to use to do a scorecard for, we can actually go and see for guidance based on departments and agencies, and actually, in fact, what American Water Works Association did for the American Water and Wastewater Treatment Community, we can see guidance in terms of what specifically they should do that are unique to their area. So obviously someone in healthcare is not going to be worried about the things that someone in energy distribution system is going to be worried about. They're going to have to comply with different rules and regulations because it's the nature of their respective businesses. But as you might imagine, they all play by different rules. So yes, they start with the core, they start with the sections, they have the subsections, but then the different regulations that apply to them will vary. Well, everything looks good. I mean, we now have some yardsticks we can measure by, established standards, probably some of the stuff these different sectors are doing. So why is this a problem? Well, it goes back to, I've got my slides reversed, this slide. Now, I can't speak to the other sectors, but I did do some research on water, wastewater. And these are basically the number of companies with these number of employees across the x-axis. And if you do the math real quick, what you would quickly discover is in the state of Indiana, approximately 50% of the companies that do water, wastewater treatment or utilities have 5 employees or less. Now, these are folks that got into the water business. They're not IT specialists. And if you think, and if you look even further in terms of what the North American Industrial Code information tells us, they have average revenues of about $250,000 per employee. So it brings up a couple of issues. One is they're not going to have internally the expertise for a cybersecurity expert. Secondly, they're not going to have a lot of money because they are regulated utilities in most cases to go out and hire one. So how do you do a cybersecurity scorecard when you're dealing with an audience that is not going to have the time, or if they have the time, are not going to have the expertise, and may not have the willpower to go through all this with everything else they have to do on the plate. So here you've got a spectrum. You've got something as simple as was used by the National Governors Association last year to kind of get a feel for respectively how these different states were doing, okay, and that's what the governor filled out. And then you've got something like the cybersecurity framework, which is very impactful. Probably a lot of the large organizations are doing, but a small one, you know, where this thing's going to go to an office manager to fill out, has to figure out. So this is a challenge that we're working with right now, is how do you kind of get that middle spot there? Now, if we had the resources, we could do something like Purdue's Health Advisors does. They have federal funding to go out and actually interview healthcare organizations up to a certain size. And so they have individuals that they'll use the same NIST standards, but they'll be able to say, oh, you're a small practice. I'm not going to bother you with some of these questions, but I'll get the essence of what we need to have for this. No, the way we're going to have to do this for the state is individuals are going to have to fill them out for themselves. So that's what makes it challenging. So basically, these are the things we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to eliminate duplicate effort. You know, how do we help the state get a good cybersecurity scorecard when it reports to MS-ISAC, when it reports to the Governors Association? And it would be really cool if we could just have one question that could fill it all out, but that's not going to be quite feasible. How do we design a scorecard so that we can identify systemic issues? So again, going back to water, wastewater, where I have a little experience, is you saw the problem with the sizes of the utilities. They obviously cannot all afford their own cybersecurity expert. So maybe they do what boards of educations do in remote areas where they don't have a lot of students, and they share IT experts between them. Okay, that's one way to work around it without having to get a lot of money that you don't have. Another example, water, wastewater. At least the standards I saw as of about a year ago that consultants use to design specifications for municipalities to build a water, wastewater treatment plant doesn't require cybersecurity to be bolted onto controls. Wouldn't that be a cheaper time to get it in there? You know, when you're going to spend $2 to $3 million for a greenfield or an add-on for water, wastewater, and you know, it's going to be a smaller part of the budget, less concerns about how much it costs, and also much easier than trying to strap on cybersecurity afterwards. So the NIST standard is good because it will help us get to apples and apples and standards, but the challenge we're going to have is for the first pass to get actionable item reliably for the state, how do we do this? Now, walking into this with two assumptions. I think everyone would be happy if the cybersecurity scorecard would be simple to do and someone else had to do all the work and provide all the money. So I wanted to dispel that illusion from those who are going to deal with this and say, no, this is going to be something for everyone to provide inputs to. It might require some, most, if not everyone, to actually act on the information. And it's also going to provide a benchmark for the organizations to see how they're doing. Now, what we looked at, and again, this is a work in process. That's why the slide said in the beginning, IPR, in-process review, is we said, okay, we have 98 questions we can ask without all additional specifications in the NIST cybersecurity framework. We can't ask all of them. How do we neck down what we're going to do? Well, the answer is, what's important to the IECC committee? And we said, okay, once we understand that, we need to define what the endpoints are. What do we expect people to actually provide their cybersecurity scorecard on? And then, how do we receive that data? Now, the answer to the last one is we're looking at using Qualtrics as a way of gathering the information and having Purdue be the honest broker to protect anonymity, to provide trends to the government and the private sector as well. So, as a starting point in terms of what's important to IECC, because they didn't tell us, you can't find it in the strategic vision, is we're using Department of Defense's December 2016 focal areas, okay? They didn't come across this casually. They came across this by studying a lot of the different cyber attacks they'd suffered from and said, ooh, we really need to work on our authentication. So they've got the money, they've got the resources. They're going to look at doing something in addition to CAT cards, which some of you are familiar with, common access cards. They're going to look at more things they might want to do with biometrics and other two-factors authentication. Looking at hardening devices, in other words, well, we'll get into this in a second. Then reducing the attack surface and detecting and responding to potential intrusions. This you can find easily on the internet by that title. So a little more about this. Ensuring strong authentications. This is pretty familiar to most of you. Small businesses are not going to be able to look at changing CAT cards or whatever. They probably don't have them. But there's now commercially available more ways to do two-factor authentication. And there may be standards that are very sector specific. I suspect if we went through the standards, we'd find some things that the energy world has to do that, by George, you're going to do it. There's no option, okay, that other sectors may not find required. Hardening devices, the normal, good hygiene we talked about. Had a good friend. I won't tell you what kind of practice it is, who the friend is, but his wife ran the bookkeeping. And way after Microsoft, a couple of years after Microsoft quit supporting XP, she finally said, okay, Jim, now you can come down and help swap this out to a newer operating system. It was very hard for her to change. She was very familiar with the look and feel of what she had. Her focus was on doing all the bookkeeping, not being a cyber expert. But you need to continue, of course, that effort, including it. Configuring all devices correctly, disabling hypertext markup language. This is very common within DoD. Not sure it would work for all sectors, but those are some ideas to look at. Reducing the attack surface, really simple. If it doesn't need to be connected to the outside, reduce it. And in fact, for water, wastewater, that might be one option. Is the benefit of having remote access to a specific site worth it? Based on the money saved by having remote access and versus the cost of trying to keep it from being attacked. Don't know. But that work has to be done. And if it makes sense, then we just gap it. As I mentioned during the previous presentation, we can't afford the cost on everything. And of course, detecting and responding to potential intrusions. Now, what we did is we took those 4 focus areas from DoD and we mapped them against the NIST cybersecurity framework. And we reduced the number of questions we had to ask of individuals. Now, right now, working with Ms. Shatrice Mosley from the state, she wants to reduce this, at least for this pilot, the first go-around, to about 20 questions. So we're going to have to do some Pareto analysis. Which ones are going to provide the best payback? And she'd also like to reduce the scoring down to about 5. Maybe with this kind of language, but she said there's some differentiation here that's just going to be so subtle that most individuals are not going to even know how to measure it. So let's keep it simple. Now, that doesn't preclude organizations in the state that are doing it anyhow from using the more robust side of the NIST cybersecurity framework. And there probably are staff for it. But a small practice, like the ones we talked about for water, wastewater, that's not so much an option for them. So where are we on this process? Well, the IECC meets about once a quarter. Their next meeting is going to be at the end of April. So what we want to plan to get to them is basically a pilot so that we can test not only the questions, make sure they make sense, but also to make sure that the way we collect the data gives them actionable information. So how do you measure scorecard success in this case? Well, some people, quite frankly, would be just happy if everyone became aware because they did a scorecard. And that's good. That's motivational. But it's not sufficient, okay? Some people would like to kind of use this as, hey, look, we're making progress, okay? This is good. We're better off than we were last year. But as you look at the title of the article on the bottom, the guys that want to attack us, they don't really care what our timeline is for doing the cybersecurity scorecard, okay? They're just going to move out. So we need to make sure as we kind of look through this that we use the scorecard, I'll just cut to the chase real fast, accelerate the rates that we improve in cybersecurity. Now, it's a real challenge in this organization because it's a public-private partnership. It's a team of the willing. And it's going to have to continue to be that way. I mean, as you know, most of the cyber assets are in the private sector. They're not in the government. But what we're going to continue proposing is that we take a look at trying to measure these different factors. Now, how much can you get out of 20 questions with 5 different levels of measure? Who knows? But the effort shouldn't just be to stop here or to go here, but get down as far as we can in the other areas as well. So as we kind of launched into this project, it reminded me of Alice in Wonderland. And you probably remember the part where the Cheshire Cat, when asked by Alice, says, tell me what to do. And he says, well, what is it you want to do? Or where do you want to go? And she says, well, I'm not sure. And he said, well, then you can go anywhere you want. And it'll just take you longer to get there. And so that's why we have to very deliberately walk through this process of getting the scorecard right, not just for the pilot, but for the subsequent versions to move this along. And at this point, I'd like to invite any comments or questions. We are more than happy to get any help that you might want to offer.
So it's a fascinating look at what you're trying to do for the state, and I think it's very challenging dealing with, I guess, such a diverse group of constituencies. I'm pretty familiar with what DoD did with their scorecard, and one of the reasons I think it was fairly successful was that the measurements were very actionable, right? It's very easy to measure, how much old versions of Windows you had in your infrastructure. And that was actionable, right? I got to get rid of it. Some of the others weren't that. But is that one of the criteria that you use for which questions you'll select? And how do you measure that? How do you distinguish a question that might be nice for say, a state level committee to know, but it's hard for the water company to use to guide action? Is there a set of criteria that you use for that? Do you bounce it off actual system owners? How do you do that?
Yeah, if you take a look at our timeline, we're moving kind of fast. And part of this is an education process. So having been in those situations, like have you migrated your cybersecurity to a new operating system and watched how you can do that within DoD, unfortunately, when you're working with a team of the willing, it gets a little harder. So what Professor Dietz and I have talked about is we need to help the state with questions that everyone's going to go, yeah, that's good, and make them measurable. I did knowledge management for 7 years, 2 years in Iraq at a core and a theater level, and then 5 years. And I have a couple of expressions for knowledge management operations. One is, it's human nature, institutional behavior to want to maximize bonus, mitigate risk, and shift liability. And so we have to overcome that inertia, as well as the one where if I make you look good in front of your boss and take work off your hands, I'll be your best friend forever. But if I require you to change for the greater good, you may not like me nearly as much. And what we're looking at here is those two paradigms, is how do you affect that? So I believe the state's in a unique position where they have, having created this IECC, they can say, let's agree on our metrics. Let's kind of do a Pareto analysis and say, based on the pain that we're having, where's our greatest risk? Going back to the previous presentation, where we can invest and mitigate that risk. Where can we spend $1,000 that'll prevent something that has a 40% chance of happening each year that will cost us $2 million? That's a no-brainer, okay? The other one no-brainer is, why would we want to spend $1 million for something that has a 1% probability of happening in 100 years and it's only going to cost us 10 bucks, okay? That's the other no-brainer. It's that area in the middle that's really hard. And that's kind of what we're trying to push them towards, or help them with anyhow. We can't push them, but we can help them. So it's messy.
Good afternoon. I'm George Bailey from Purdue Healthcare Advisors. Thanks for the name drop, Jim. I commend you on what you're trying to do here. I don't know that Qualtrics is the correct delivery mechanism. We've been doing very similar activities for healthcare here in the state of Indiana for almost 7 years, and the biggest piece is that your constituents, folks that are going to be getting that Qualtrics survey, they're not going to know the first thing to answer the first question. We cover 11 different domains, anywhere from 100 to 200 questions, and we may spend 4 hours on site with an organization, and it still just skims the surface of what we really need to know to assess their risk. So we end up doing a variety of technical tasks to fill in the blanks, right? They'll say, oh yeah, of course we have password policies. And you do a password audit and you realize what you do, but you've exempted all your employees of your policy. So, but I will commit that if the council can develop the questionnaire, PHA will deliver it to 200 different organizations this year if you want us to. Because we'll just roll it in to our workflow. So just keep that in the back of your hat. Because it'll help us understand how they relate to the peers. Because the way that we do it today, it's hard to compare client to client, organization to organization, unless you really have a deep dive with the advisor that happened to spend the day with them. So
yeah, it's, I'll rub my Purdue button here. I'm not worried about the healthcare sector since you guys are there. Sure. Yeah.
I'm still worried about healthcare. If you're looking at Pareto principle, we agonized over this. We wanted to see every healthcare delivery organization do a self-assessment against NIST framework, but 85% of them don't have a single security person on staff, so there's no one that even knows what the words mean. So for a bunch of other reasons, independent of that, I'm quite fond of the Australian Signals Directorate, ASD, DSD Top 4. They have a prioritized list, just like the artist formerly known as SANS Top 20. The CIS controls. But the top 4 really aren't even security. They're asset inventory, patching, software inventory, patching, whitelisting. Those alone, if you're Gene Kim, former alum of Purdue grad school and whatnot, in Visible Ops, he said, do you know what you have? Do you know when it changes? Do you have zero unplanned changes? Really well-managed asset inventory, often, security is often a byproduct of well-managed IT. So those are A, measurable, B, beneficial to the state, and C, don't require domain expertise. So I'd strongly push there, and I'd be happy to explain more later.
Yeah, based on having, okay, how much can I say? So one of the things we learned from an exercise is that the state a couple of years ago was focusing what happens after the fact. what happens after an attack. I would maintain it's far cheaper to prevent the attack from being successful in the first place. So I like what you're saying. It's basically, what do we do to prevent?
Okay. Just to wrap it up, we're looking at a simple method of measuring. I would say a lot of my research is just building rulers. This is just another ruler that we desperately need, the state needs, and that hopefully we provide a little bit of insight as to how we get started in this process and staff and develop over that time. Basic engineering. We figure out how to measure, and we figure out how to model and optimize. We might find out the measures are screwed up, the measures might need modified, but that's where we're at with this. So I appreciate the input and the advice.
Thank you.